I'm Allie Katz, the program coordinator here at the Writers House. We are thrilled to have Professor Carey and David Daley, I'm sorry, I've been looking at your name all day, come to have a conversation about writing and also about this amazing book, Ratf, K-E-D, I don't know how you would say that out loud. It's one of these incredibly relevant.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
You could definitely say it on the recording. I was being coy.
Yes.
This is one of these essential texts on how to deal with sort of dirty, underhand tricks, fake news, and the kinds of ways that certain people may be interrupting the American political process. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Carey and David.
Good evening.
Hi.
Hi. I am really very grateful to sort of start this conversation with David Daley. He came to my classroom and talked with students about writing, about work he had done as a journalist, first as a young journalist doing everything in a small town in Connecticut, then moving from small to large newspapers, working as the head of Salon.com. So we also talked about doing print versus doing online. He worked for a while doing sort of rock and roll journalism, right? Following some rock groups across the country.
I look crazy, don't I?
Foo Fighters and others, which was really delightful to hear and lots of fun. And then we also talked, especially my students read his book about gerrymandering, which is a book which is not titled Gerrymander Nation. As you can see, it's not at all going to bring people in like the current title he has, which is Ratf, which they worked on and had a focus group, and
people
tell us
love
about it.
The profanity, it turns out.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing. We actually really did sell this book as Gerrymandered Nation, and the marketing department on the very first day was like, not only can that not be the title, but gerrymandering can't be anywhere on the cover, in the subtitle, or any place. So figure it out. And I didn't mind that, because the goal of this book was not to write a dull academic treatise. It's already a dull academic topic, right? The goal was to explain to people why it mattered so much, and why this topic that kind of made your eyes glaze over in 8th grade civics class actually was essential and crucial and sort of fundamental to the terrible state that our politics had become. The toxic, extreme, polarized, partisan nature of our politics really all traces back to this. So we sat in a room and came up with about a dozen titles, and as soon as the title Ratfucked left my mouth, I knew I would never be able to tell my mom I had a book out. But I didn't ever think it would fly with a focus group the way it did. And they came back and they said, you won't believe it, but it was off the charts. The number one with a bullet is Ratfucked. So there's the title of the book. And it should have it told me something in 2015. If I had been smart enough to actually learn from this, it would have told me that there was an anger in the country about our political system that cut across both sides, and in some ways it should have been an early warning to me about the power of Sanders and about the power of Trump. In many ways, the key word of 2016 was rigged, and it resonated on both political sides. And I think that perhaps in some ways Ratfucked was an early indicator of what was going on out there.
Let's talk a little bit about how the book began. We started the question in class with something for young writers about how you learn what stories are yours to tell. And you know that's important, right? So you don't pick an aria when you should be singing the blues, right? And it messes you up. But you started talking about asking questions. And would you tell us the sequence of questions that backed you into this topic that you say is the most boring and academic, but it isn't because we're reading it?
I fundamentally did not understand why the Democrats didn't take back the U.S. House in 2012. And it didn't occur to me that that was the question that I should be asking, but I mean, I was running Salon, so I was running our politics coverage day by day, and, you know, Sandy Hook happens, and you don't get any gun control legislation out of it. There's a government shutdown just, you know, in October of 2013, I think, over the debt ceiling and, you know, just basically paying our bills. There's, you know, 50 different votes to repeal Obamacare, even though there's no sense that Obama was ever not going to veto any of those votes. So our politics had become sort of not only had become shrill and polarized and paralyzed and dysfunctional. And I said, and I thought, well, wait a second. The Democrats won the Senate in 2012, and Barack Obama was reelected in 2012. Why didn't they also take back the House? So I started looking into it, and I said, and I learned that the Democrats actually got 1.4 million more votes than Republicans in 2012. And I thought, boy, that's kind of strange, amazing that that didn't equate into more seats. And it turns out you had to go back about 40 years to find an example when the Democrats had gotten more votes but hadn't actually taken control of the House. And the first state I saw was actually Pennsylvania. And I said, Pennsylvania has a delegation of 18 congressmen, and there's 13 Republicans. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I went, well, there were actually 100,000 more votes for Democratic candidates in 2012, but still it turned out that more than 70% of the seats went to Team Red. And the more questions I asked, the more I realized that this was a political strategy. This was how the Republicans plotted their path back to power after the big wins of 2008 for the Democrats. And in a lot of ways, it's a story of two elections. The story of what happened in 2008 when the Democrats win the White House. We have the historic election of our first African-American president, but also a Democratic supermajority in the Senate and a 60-seat margin in the U.S. House. And if you go back and look at the TV coverage of that night, you don't have to. I did in the book. And the smartest minds in American politics are talking about how the Republicans are going to be a minority party in this country for a generation because of the changing demographic nature of the country and our increasing diversity. Well, it didn't exactly happen that way, right? And it didn't happen that way because Republicans immediately got to work. They recognized that 2010 was a redistricting year, it's a census year, that every 10 years we redraw all of these lines to account for population changes after the US Census, but that also gives you the ability to draw new lines if you can control that process. And so what the Republicans did was they launched a political strategy aimed at taking control of state legislative chambers, especially in states that were key for redistricting. And it was a concentrated, focused strategy called REDMAP, which was a short for the Redistricting Majority Project. And it was focused in all of these states that I couldn't understand how they had gone so red. So it's focused in Ohio, it's focused in Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, all of these bluish-purplish states that we don't understand what's happened to the politics of them, right? A lot of this starts with redistricting.
Right now, we didn't get to this early enough to pull up on the screen, but maybe someone can. The 14th district
Oh, it's amazing, isn't it, right?
of
Michigan's
Michigan?
14th is pretty impressive, but so is Pennsylvania's 7th, and that's...
Let's do Pennsylvania's
and that's
7th,
right down the
since we
street.
know
Yeah.
it's right here, just to take a look at that. It's an interesting, and maybe while someone's doing that, you could talk about your experience. You talked about figuring out how to tell this story. Of course, now we can't see. We'll watch over here. You talked about having this story and figuring out how to make the story come alive. Right?
Because it's a story about maps. It's a story about political strategists in back rooms. So, part of the story becomes, talking about their strategies and introducing these consultants and going through the court transcripts over lawsuits over these maps and their emails and the like. But you also have to kind of bring it to life by getting out and showing why it matters. So part of what I wanted to do was go out and actually drive a lot of these districts because we often think of gerrymandering in the wrong way. We think of it as being about funny-looking shapes. And whenever there's redistricting, every publication in the country does, here are the 10 weirdest-looking maps in the country. And we laugh at it. But all of those lines have a reason. They're all there for really precise surgical intent. And until you get out and sort of drive it and look at it and see it, you don't necessarily understand the intent. But I drove around a lot of Pennsylvania's 7th, and I went out and drove Michigan's 14th around Detroit turn by turn. And when you see those little squiggles on the map, and then when you see how directly they correspond to questions of race and class and ethnicity and economics, it is absolutely startling how over the course of a day, turn by turn, your mind is blown again and again at sort of what's inside the district and what is just outside the line. And those map makers knew exactly what they were doing.
What are we looking at here? We can't quite see from here. It's up there.
District 7.
Is that Donald Duck kicking Goofy?
Yes, it is.
There we go.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, that's a good one. And sometimes it's fun to give them names. But I mean, all of those squiggles are there for exact, precise purposes. There's a mile-long stretch of that district in Norristown that you can go in and out of 3 different districts, and you can just watch the neighborhoods change. You kind of get, if you get off the Pennsylvania Turnpike in Norristown and sort of drive up Main Street for the first little while there, you are in what I believe is the 13th, but don't hold me to that. And that's a Democratic district. It's a very poor neighborhood, and you see people walking along the streets, walking home from their jobs at chain stores, wearing their branded polo shirts from wherever it is that they're working, and it's 99-cent stores and the like. And then suddenly you turn a corner and go up a hill, and the neighborhood completely changes. And the houses are set back from the streets, and it's white people walking fancy dogs, and it goes like that for about a half a mile, and then the neighborhood changes again, and suddenly it's like a beer depot and a gun store, and you're in another district. The specificity is just amazing.
So speaking of dogs walking fancy white people, speaking of that kind of activity, tell us where you're going to go after this. You're leaving us and you're going to go for a run somewhere. I am.
I'm going down to Asheville, North Carolina, where they are having a gerrymandering 5K.
We could do this, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
We could do
Donald
this.
Duck kicking Goofy 5K. I am obsessed with this district in Asheville. And I mean, Asheville is like this, it's a pretty hippie, democratic town in North Carolina. It's nestled in the mountains in the western Republican part of the state, but it's, the biggest city out there, and it's very democratic. And really there's 2 ways of gerrymandering. There's cracking and there's packing. And by packing, your goal is to take all of the votes of the other side and to stick them in as few districts as you possibly can, so you get all the surrounding ones. And if you're cracking them, you're trying to divide them up and spread them out kind of as narrowly as you can across as many districts as possible, so that they can't elect a member of their own choosing. And what the Republicans did in Asheville was just amazing. So that they took this Democratic city, and it had been a Democratic member of Congress there, and they drew a dividing line smack through the city. They just cracked it right in two. They put half the voters in the 10th, half the voters in the 11th. The Democrat took one look at this, said, I can't win here, didn't run for re-election. And it's an amazing example of how this matters and why it matters, because gerrymandered uncompetitive districts elect different kinds of representatives. So instead of this kind of conservative Democrat who had represented that district, a guy named Mark Meadows runs in the Republican primary for that seat. Mark Meadows is now the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, the most hardline conservative wing of the Congress. He's the guy who essentially forces John Boehner out of leadership. He campaigns and he wins his election by saying he's going to send Barack Obama back to Kenya or wherever it is he's from. And it's that kind of hardline, divisive rhetoric, because the only election that matters in a gerrymandered a district is the party primary. So you are running to the most extreme wing because you know your seat is safe. So you talk all of this nonsense. When you get into office, you are not interested in compromise or deal making or anything else. It's Mark Meadows who is key in shutting down the government in 2013. It's Meadows who's playing a key role in all of the Trump care. And different kinds of districts and different kinds of members, it accelerates the polarization we already have, and it has really fundamentally changed our politics.
Talk to us a little about the one bargain that has been struck different times in history in the South with gerrymandering. Will you a little bit? And a lot of it has to do with race, but this is particularly between black and white leaders in the South. Yeah,
and this is interesting. There are two key kinds of gerrymandering. There's partisan gerrymandering and there's racial gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court has made it clear that racial gerrymandering is not okay, and if you are using racial data, you have to be very careful with that, but that partisan gerrymandering is just fine. And the various reauthorizations of the Voting Rights Act over the years have given the folks who draw these lines, different kinds of guidance. And in the 1980s, when the act is reauthorized under Ronald Reagan, they include a provision that says you ought to be able to draw majority-minority seats wherever you can. So they tried to encourage the drawing of seats that would elect African Americans or Latinos or other ethnic minorities, which sounds like a really good idea and a positive goal for social legislation. Except Republicans took one look at this and they said, wait a second, if we can draw districts that pack as many African Americans as we can into as few districts as possible, we're going to win all of the surrounding seats. So they got really, really excited about this idea. And they eagerly formed alliances with African Americans in the South and said, we're going to buy you computers, we're going to buy you the software, we're going to show you how to draw these districts. And it was a terrific thing for African American representation in the South, which soars in the 1990s. North Carolina elects its first African Americans in 100 years. And that's a really important and positive thing. But they also drew these districts in such a way that they packed as many African American voters as they could into those two districts, and Republicans took all of the surrounding ones. So it was an interesting bargain. Yeah,
thank you. You're now, after Salon, you began to work for something called FairVote. Tell us a little bit what FairVote does. It's a nonprofit organization. It's in Washington. It's funded by the Flora Hewlett Foundation, Rockefeller, Ford Foundation. So some large foundations were putting their money into this FairVote. Talk to us about its mission and your work there.
Sure. Really, it's one of the largest nonprofits in the country, kind of thinking about new voting systems and new ways that we can take all of this extremism and polarization out of our politics. Our biggest issues really involve ranked choice voting and also multi-member districts. And they are designed to be ideas that sort of add additional voice and choice back into the process. We have an act that's been introduced before Congress right now that's called the Fair Representation Act. And really, if you think about gerrymandering as being such a fundamental problem, districting is almost a bigger problem. It's the nature of these single district, winner-take-all districts that sort of forces all of this extremism and all of these at this side or that side, a choice onto us. And I mean, gerrymandering in many ways is kind of like cancer. There's lots of different kinds of gerrymandering, and there's lots of different cures for it. And you could fix partisan gerrymandering, and you could fix racial gerrymandering with court cases, but that wouldn't do anything to sort of make our politics more competitive in a lot of states where, take a state like Massachusetts or a state like Oklahoma, where there's complete delegations of Democrats or complete delegations of Republicans. And the entire state doesn't vote that way, but all of the representation goes that way. So if you were able to design a voting system that was based less on districts and sort of more on voters actually choosing candidates, so larger districts, and you get a choice of a number of candidates and several of them represent you, you've got a better chance of electing somebody who you agree with, who shares your views. And right now, a lot of people in an awful lot of states simply don't have a chance of that. So the work at FairVote really is designed around trying to pivot us to electoral systems that re-incentivize politicians to act in different ways and give all of us more choice and make our votes count more.
And you moved into this work because of the book? Is that what? So you started out as a journalist. You didn't start out as a voting advocacy writer, advocate.
No, I've been doing journalism for 25 years, and I'm still writing about most of these issues most days. But and just ask my wife. It's crazy once you sort of have your eyes open to kind of the root problem of gerrymandering in districts. You see it every place, and kind of once you start kind of looking at the world this way, you just want to do all you can to try and raise the alarm and fix the root cause of so much of the dysfunction and extremism in our politics, and so much of it is tied to this issue, and we're not talking about it in the right way. So I'm eager to do anything I can to kind of raise my voice and talk about these issues.
Great, thank you. I want to just pause for a moment. Sometimes you come to these and the two people have a conversation and you're thinking things and they never shut up. You've been to those? I see you. You've been to those. I see them. So I want to pause for a little moment. There are lots, you're talking about lots of complicated, complex things. So I want us to give us a moment. The other thing is that if you can't think of a question fast enough, and sometimes you never get it. So I want to take a little, like a non-commercial, non-profit break for a moment while you think about some of the things that have been said and maybe come up with questions. Yes.
So many questions.
You have so many. Yes. And please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you write before you.
My name is Lisa Funderburg. I'm an instructor in creative nonfiction here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm also a freelance journalist. And I came to this event tonight because in the wake of the last presidential election, many people I know have been trying to figure out what to do, how to focus their energies on advancing what they think of as justice or resistance. And one of my sisters chose gerrymandering. She's made buttons, she's doing all sorts of things. She's very active in it, and that's great. And I don't really understand it.
Okay.
And I read about it. So I have so one thing is, the one thing I love, which if other people here don't know, I think they would really like, is the story of how it got its name.
Yeah.
But then I thought maybe it would also be helpful for me anyway, if you talked specifically about the particular mission of your book, Ratfucked, because I want to say the name.
Everybody does. People secretly want to say
It's
the
like
name.
permission to
I
swear.
know.
The particular mission of this
Yes.
project of yours and how that informed your structure of the book,
Sure.
Crafting.
Gerrymandering takes its name from Elbridge Gerry. I don't know why they call it gerrymandering when it's Elbridge Gerry with a hard G, but that's what history does. And he was the governor of Massachusetts in 1812. There's the salamander up on screen. Very good. And he was a member of the Republican Party, and they ran against the Federalists, and the Federalists were on the march in Massachusetts in 1812, and what Gary's party did was they drew those state Senate districts around Massachusetts, especially around the Boston area, in such a way as to make it almost impossible for the Federalists to win. So indeed, in 1812, the Federalists get, tens of thousands of more votes in Massachusetts, but they do not come close to a majority of seats. A political cartoonist draws that cartoon. He thinks that the districts resemble a salamander, and it becomes known as the gerrymander. Now, that was not the first example of politicians drawing lines in order to favor their own side. Patrick Henry, who's best known for "Give me liberty or give me death," actually helped give us the gerrymander himself. Patrick Henry draws district lines in Virginia ahead of the First Continental Congress with the goal of keeping James Madison out. It doesn't work, but it's one of the really earliest examples in the country of trying to use district lines in order to give your side an advantage. So really, that's what gerrymandering is. Gerrymandering is the dark art of trying to draw lines in such a way as to maximize your own party's advantage and to minimize the voice of the other side. Now, as you can imagine, gerrymandering back in 1788 in Patrick Henry's day or 1812 in Elbridge Gerry's day is very different from the kind of gerrymandering that takes place today, because the way that we draw these lines has changed. They were drawing them back then with parchment paper and magic markers, even up through 1990 and 2000, that's how these districts are being drawn. And the project of my book is to talk about how redistricting changes in 2010. First, because Republicans understand that redistricting represents a political path back to power after the Democrats' big sweep in 2008, and in the face of all of these demographic trends that are threatening to make them a minority party. So they're immediately interested in the idea of, we could draw districts in such a way that, pack all the Democrats into as few districts as we can, and this might be a way to sort of hold off all of those demographic trends and hold on to power, even though there are fewer of us. So gerrymandering has been especially effective in that regard. So you have all of these states where Democrats get more votes, but Republicans take more seats. And it's not only in Congress, it's also in the state houses and state legislatures in these states. So North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, all of these big purplish states, Democrats often get more votes. Republicans often hold supermajorities, veto-proof supermajorities in state legislatures, giving them the ability to drive through aggressive conservative legislation without having to worry about being voted out of office, because the district lines have essentially given them the power to do this with impunity because they can't be beaten. The other piece of this that is different in 2010 is the sophistication of the computers and the software and the big data and the amount of information that goes into drawing these lines. So it used to be that you would do your best guess of how these lines might advantage your side in the next election. But by the second or third election under these maps, and they last 10 years, every 10 years we stop and do it over again, the people move, people die, people become 18 and start voting. So there could be a big political change. I mean, even in the last decade, I mean, even in 2000, Republicans did a pretty good gerrymander in 2000, but in 2006, you have a kind of rising frustration with the economy and the Iraq war, and Democrats have a big wave election the other way. So they were able to sort of undo it. The gerrymander, it was not so precise and sophisticated that a voter wave couldn't turn it over the other way. What you see in 2012, indeed, is the district lines become a firewall because you have those 1.4 million more votes. But it's because they're able to draw these lines now with the help of all of this big data. So it's not, so it's all of this, the information collected in the census, but then you can load up onto these really sophisticated mapping programs, these GIS mapping programs that just show you every single house, voting records. You can cross-tabulate that against actual voting results on a block-by-block level. And then, you know, driver's licenses. And then you can purchase all of the other information that we readily hand out about ourselves that we maybe weren't making as easy in 2000. So all the digital breadcrumbs we leave as we go around the internet, social media likes, you know, web searches, things we buy, the very same algorithms that tell Amazon and Netflix what it is we might want to buy, those ads that follow us around the web, all of that is sold by marketing companies and can be uploaded into these powerful computer programs. And we're so partisan, we're so polarized, there are so few of us that are persuadable. If you know a little bit about somebody, you've got a pretty good sense of how they're going to vote. So you are able to draw much more surgical and precise lines now than you ever could before. So it's this combination of the partisan, so it's the combination of the partisan intent and the lines. It's the data, the technology, and the ease and frequency with which it can be manipulated that makes the 2010-2011 cycle so fundamentally different from any other in our history.
You were talking about what bits of information give these mapping programs, give them a profile that predicts voting. Some of those, and you said just a few that are it's a very sparse, but it's a different way of thinking about identity. Give us just that bullet list of what would tell us, predict how we'd vote.
Sure. Well, I mean, I could start, there's all the information in the census. So you've got kind of all the demographic information there, all of the religious information there, the economic information there. So I can get a pretty good portrait of what a block looks like just by looking at the census and comparing it to that block. And we've got a pretty good, you know, you've got a pretty good sense right there if you just kind of, you know, cross-tabulate that against the average makeup. You know, if you were to draw a profile, you know, simply based on census results, you could come up with a pretty good example of how somebody votes. But everything else that we do is also easily purchased. So magazine subscriptions. If you subscribe to Guns and Ammo, I've got a pretty good sense of how you vote. If you subscribe to, GQ or Cosmopolitan, I've got a pretty good sense of how you vote. But when I add that information into the profile I've already built off the census, that's pretty good. So then I can go back, I can say, okay, which elections did you vote in and which elections did you not vote in? Because all of that is a public record. So I can build that into these profiles. And then I can take the precinct level election results, and I can look all the way down ballot to the smallest elections, and those might tell me what you really are. Maybe you voted at the presidential level or a congressional level for somebody else, but if I get a sense of these races in which nobody really knows anything, you're probably going to vote for the party that you most align with. So I can take those results and factor that in. I can, Facebook is an incredibly powerful advertising tool, as we've all learned since 2016. Facebook will sell you pretty much any demographic details you possibly want on all of this. You can market so precisely based exactly on people's likes. I can figure out all of, a cloud's worth of consumer preferences. And this next time around, they'll be able to take your precise search engine results, because the FCC, one of the first things they did under Trump was make it possible for your internet service provider to sell all of your search engine results to anyone who wants to buy them. So you can have a pretty good sense that the political parties who are drawing these lines in 2021 will be pretty interested in that information. And these computers just move so fast that they are able to comprehend and churn through all of this in a second.
Nate, actually, I'm going to ask one more thing just to follow up, and then
Yeah.
You talked about the secrecy that it took to keep this activity hidden, but at the same time, it was announced, I think, in an op-ed in the New York
Right.
Times, yes?
A Wall Street Journal, yes.
Wall Street Journal.
Absolutely.
Worse yet, yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of people seeing.
It's the question that I get asked all the time is, where were the Democrats during all of this? And it's one that I just have to kind of shake my head at, because I don't know where the Democrats were. They just fell asleep. They completely didn't understand what was going on. And what makes it so crazy is that Karl Rove writes an op-ed in March of 2010. It's published in the Wall Street Journal. I guess Democrats just didn't get the newspaper that day. And they laid out the entire plan. If you control redistricting, you control the country. And they make it really clear that they were going to focus on these down-ballot races, and they were going to use that to take control of these legislative chambers in these specific states. And once they had control of the legislative chambers in those states, they were going to redistrict in such a way as to guarantee themselves a decade's worth of dominance, at least. They laid out the states. They spelled out the whole plan. They said how much money they were going to spend on it, and then they executed it. And that the Democrats didn't have the strategic imagination to come up with it, I guess I can understand that. We've been gerrymandering for a long time. Republicans invented a new paradigm of this. They changed the nature of the game. But to not have the ability to play defense in 16 states, in 107 state legislative races, when your opponents have laid out the plan on the op-ed page of the nation's largest newspaper, is just political incompetence, and we're all paying the price for it today.
Please, Bob.
That brings me to the question I was going to ask. My name is Bob Smith. I'm a former editor of various places, including Columbia Journalism Review, but now I'm an Episcopal priest who's a political junkie. But what about 2020? And are the Democrats awake now? And are they going to be able to do anything? I think I read that Eric Holder and former President Obama are involved in some effort to. Could you talk a bit about the
Sure.
prospect?
They are awake. The Democrats are woke. Holder and Obama are running something called the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. And Holder keeps saying his goal is to make redistricting sexy. It's worth a try. And they're trying to raise a lot of money in order to essentially try to do what the Republicans did to them, which is not going to be easy to do because the Republicans will always outraise you, and they start with a huge advantage on these maps. And there's no element of surprise the way that there was in 2010. The Republicans are going to be ready in all of these states when the Democrats come for them. So I'm not sure that the prospects of success are terrifically high. This is a long-term fight. I mean, it happens every 10 years, so a key year in many ways is 2020 because that's when the census will be conducted. So in 2021, we'll be redrawing all of these lines. Our state legislatures play the key role in doing that. Democrats have to find a way to take these state legislatures back, but they are so far behind the 8 ball in all of these states, and it's just a long road back. When the Republicans executed this play in 2010 in a state like Pennsylvania, all they had to do was flip one seat. Pennsylvania was 102-101 in 2010. Yeah. So they focused on 3 or 4 seats. They spent about $1 million, and they took control. And when they had every single piece of the process, they drew such good new lines that the congressional delegation goes from 12-7 Democratic to 13-5 Republican. But the state house, it went from 102-101. It's now 121-81. So that's the road that Democrats have to make up here in Pennsylvania. In a state like Ohio, it's 66-33. In Wisconsin, it's 65-34. So Democrats are way behind in all of these state legislatures as they try to get ready for 2020, and it's going to be tricky to come back. The first indication of how well they're doing will be in Virginia next week. Virginia is the most important election in the country this year because the Democrats and Republicans who are elected this year will be in charge of redistricting there in 2021. The Democrats have gone all out to win the governorship there, which is a very important race because the governor has veto power over bad maps. But they've also been running really aggressively trying to take back the state assembly, the state house. And I hate to say it, but I mean, a good night for them is going to be winning 2 or 3 seats at that level. If they make it all the way to 5, it's a landslide. That's how tricky this is. If I'm the Democrats, there's a long-term play here, but the short-term play has to be stop thinking about 2020 and focus on these governor's races in these key states where if you win one statewide race, you've got veto power over bad maps. And there's a lot of these races coming up. So, I mean, in 2018, so it's Virginia this year, but then 2018, you have governor's races here in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Florida that in many ways are going to decide the future of the Democratic Party in this country. Because if the Democrats win those races, they have a seat at the table when the lines are drawn next time. If they don't, it's 2031 until they're going to have a chance to make it back. So I would be focused there and then trying to do the long-term, slow and steady work of trying to take these legislative chambers back. But that is a long, long road.
The vetoing of redistricting, is that true in every state?
Every state's a little bit different. But I mean, like North Carolina, for example,
And
it's
the
just
question,
the
I'm going to
legislature.
repeat the
Yeah.
question for our
Yes.
recording, which is the vetoing the governor's ability to veto bad maps?
Every state has their own process, and that's what's so brilliant about what the Republicans pulled off in 2010 was they examined the laws in every state, and they figured out how it's different every place, and then they executed a strategy designed to win every seat at the table and to have, veto power over all of it every place. Democrats have to try to find the places where they can exert leverage. and that would be governors of those states.
Hi there. My name is Paul. I'm a Penn alum, and I grew up in Pennsylvania 7th, have roots in the 13th, now I live in the 2nd, so case in point.
And you probably didn't even move.
Right, yeah, exactly. The district moved around me. I was curious about, I haven't read the book, but to the extent to which you used any international benchmarking in looking at both the context for how rare or significant, our system is in the United States compared to other places, but also looking forward for a pathway out of the current mess we're in.
Amen. We are really the only country in the world, the only democracy in the world at least, that allows politicians to choose their own voters, draw their own districts, pick their own lines. Just about everybody else has got a better way of doing this than we do. We are right about at the bottom. I was talking about, multi-member districts and ranked choice voting earlier, and, most civilized democracies around the world have moved away from this idea of winner take all and towards something that's more proportional and fairer. Even the countries that still district have got better ways of doing it than we do. I mean, Mexico, for example, uses a commission, and it's a nonpartisan commission that's like run by someone with the title of like the judge of statistics or something, and these are the people in charge of drawing the lines, and the political parties get a look at them, but there are clear standards laid out, and the political parties are only allowed to change them if they're able to make them better and to make them meet each of those standards in a closer way. It's the same thing in Germany or a lot of other districted countries. So we have designed this terrible system hundreds of years ago, and it's a mess of an electoral system, and I mean so many of the decisions that were made about it were made in order to keep power in the hands of the few. It was to first keep the power in the hands of the white propertied men who were allowed to vote. And then all of the compromises involving the Electoral College and the addition of non-slave states and slave states into the country. And I mean, all of these districting and electoral decisions have been made over the years, usually for horrible reasons, and we are it's long past time for us to be taking a really solid structural look at joining the 21st century. And until we understand that it's the structural nature of this kind of winner-take-all, allowing politicians to draw districts, that is at the root of so many, if politicians aren't incentivized to compromise, but if they're incentivized instead to sort of guard their base because the only thing they have to fear is a primary challenge, of course they're going to act in insane ways and just fight to be the most insane candidate. And that's exactly what happens. I mean, that's how you get Mark Meadows in North Carolina instead of Heath Shuler. It's how you go from a conservative, middle-of-the-road Democrat to someone saying, I want to kick Barack Obama back to his home state of Kenya. It's how you go from someone who is trying to actually compromise and solve problems to a birther with real power. So these structural ways in which we organize our elections matter deeply and help generate the kind of outcomes that we get.
You can go home and tell your sister that you know something about it now.
I'm buying the book.
And a drink.
Please.
My name's Sam. I do some freelance reporting here, but I guess what's like one of the big narratives of the 2016 election was that Trump's success and Sanders' success both seem to express like dissatisfaction with the some of the more established power centers in those parties. So I'm wondering how that gerrymandering is all a conversation about the Republican and Democratic parties, but as those parties start to look maybe less stable, if that impacts how you think about gerrymandering, or I'm just curious.
I don't think the parties look less stable. I'm not seeing a lot of voices in the Republican Party criticizing Donald Trump. The only people who I see who are willing to criticize Donald Trump are two senators who have said they're not running for re-election and one who has terminal brain cancer. So I think that, and I think that that's because of districting, because the base is in charge, the activist, angry base is in charge of the Republican Party. And these senators know, these congressmen know that they can't cross that base or they will lose their jobs. What will happen to Jeff Flake and to Bob Corker will happen to them. I think the parties, the parties certainly look less stable, but I think in reality, what we have is a country in which everyone's chosen a side, and there are fewer persuadable people than ever, and the Trump base, that sort of 33 to 37% is not going anywhere, and that is the base that turns out in these primaries. That is the base that's been empowered in all of these districts, and it is hard for me to see how the fever breaks inside the Republican Party. I mean, I've seen polls that if John Kasich ran against Trump in a Republican primary, he loses 75-25. So it's tricky. I mean, I think what we've done is, and I think that the Republicans did this to themselves. I mean, Trump didn't come along and create this. I think districting helped lay the groundwork that put the angriest elements of the party in charge. Republicans built a Frankenstein's monster that they couldn't control, and Trump came along and swept up the pieces of it. When you tell voters for as long as they did that they ought to be angry, that they ought to, to be targeting that anger at immigrants, and when you unleash those kinds of forces, we probably shouldn't be surprised that voters actually did get angry and believed it. And we see the results of it, I think. I think the other thing to think about is the actual actions that these gerrymandered legislatures take. And the first thing that they do is go after voting rights. And we have seen this in state after state, whether it's North Carolina, Michigan, Texas, Florida. And it's not a coincidence that that's the first thing they do, because it's the most powerful thing you possibly can do if you are trying to build governance from the minority and to hold on to it for as long as you can. It's been really effective. I mean, I think what's chilling to me is that if 2012 repeats itself in 2018 and the Democrats get more votes for the House, which I think they're likely to do, but don't take control of the chamber, which also seems like the most likely outcome, you're going to have the White House, the Senate, and the U.S. House under control of the party that got fewer votes. And that's a pretty effective redrawing of the lines. It's also hard to call that a democracy. Anyone know any jokes?
Wow. We're close. Did you want to ask one more question? Or before it's over?
Observation. What's it like to go, on tour for your book, talk about your book, and just prompt sighs, deep sighs in the audience? I keep hearing these sighs. And a corollary to that is, how do you get out of bed each day knowing what you know?
The harder question is, how do I go to sleep at night? All I do is just, I am not trying to depress anybody. My goal is not to depress, but I am not going to sugarcoat the conditions we are under. And I think that until we recognize that we have got a structural problem and that we can talk all we want about the policy problems are here because there's a structural problem. And this was done to us. We're talking a whole lot about, what Russia did to undermine our democracy, which we ought to talk about. I think we also need to be talking about what the Republican Party did to undermine our democracy. and that it was intentional, specific, surgical, and deeply consequential. And that until we are aware of it, that this isn't an accident, it's not a geography, it's not clustering, it's not that all the Democrats live in the city and that Republicans are simply more effectively spread out around the country. You know, we didn't cluster into Pennsylvania 7th. So we have got to be aware of it. We've got to talk about it. Until we talk about it, we can't fix it. And a bunch of citizens in Wisconsin got really frustrated in 2012 after Democrats won 174,000 more votes on the first maps of this decade, drawn by the Republicans in secret in their map room in a lawyer's office in Wisconsin that they claimed attorney-client privilege for the work that they were doing, and then won 60 of the 99 seats, despite almost 200,000 fewer votes. And they got together in a tea room in Milwaukee, and they started talking about what they could do, and they ended up filing the lawsuits that led to Gill versus Whitford, which is a Supreme Court case on partisan gerrymandering that is right now in front of the court. And this was a handful of angry retirees in Madison and Milwaukee, and they have got us on the doorstep of what could be the first ruling in our history that could call partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional and give us some limits on it as we head into 2020 and 2021. So I don't think anybody ought to tell you that we can't do anything about this, that citizens who are outraged and organized can't drive change. I've got a new chapter in the epilogue of the book that addresses 2016, and I talk again to one of the architects of the Republican plan to do this. And I ask him, well, the Democrats are going to be out there trying to do the same thing you did last time. You have any advice for them? And he said, pack a lunch. So I think that's pretty good advice for us all. Let's pack a lunch. There's a lot of work to do, and it's only by doing that work that we are going to have any revitalization of small d democracy. But I think we all ought to be heartened by the fact that in so many states, including this one, folks like Fair Districts PA are at work, Concerned Citizens for Democracy are at work, and they're trying things, and we're going to keep fighting. But it's a long-term fight, and we've got to know the enemy and what it is we have to do.
All right. Why don't we just leave it there? That was kind of hopeful. That was kind of hopeful to talk about how to make change. In fact, but through understanding that we have a structure that began. We always talk about the DNA of America, but that began with a structure that would figure out how the few could keep power over the many when we didn't have royalty. So it's in our DNA to find rules that will do that. It's also in our DNA to figure out how to change those rules.
That's exactly right.
All right. Good enough. Thank you,
Pack a
David
lunch.
Daley. Thank you so much.